Hey folks, today's episode is a bit of a change of pace. Specifically, I'm going to go over RocketBrush Studio's horde-based roguelite, The Unliving. Given that this game was released into early access, this won't be a full review as there's certain elements of the game that still haven't been implemented. So, join me as I try to discern if this dungeon dive was dead on arrival, or if I fell in love with this necromantic release. I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. A terrible blast, a scorched hamlet, and at the center of it all a mysterious mage missing his memories, though not the terrible talents that allow him to force the dead to do his bidding. The Unliving puts you in the shoes of the Necromancer after a dread ritual went awry, leaving him the arduous task of piecing together his past as well as his soul, given its brutal sundering. Thankfully, he's not quite alone in this ordeal, as one fragment remains to him. The phylacterium, which serves as his tether to the world and the mechanical excuse for why you can just repeatedly die and come back to life. As far as the execution, I actually didn't mind it. The amnesia element serves as a decent vehicle for some natural feeling exhibition between the necromancer and the allies at the hub, while still keeping the quick pace for a game that expects you to die and try again. Though, I'll admit it was a nice touch to see things like an NPC's name update as his recollections returned to him, or for them to comment on my progression as I went forward. Even if this occasionally meant they commented on things slightly out of order, potentially because I made more progress than the developers were expecting. Having someone theory craft on where a particular essence I'm searching for is, after I've snagged it, is mildly funny, even if the exchange does serve to highlight the necromancer's character. On that note, I also appreciated that not only did the bosses get some mild characterization, but the game actually takes into account your past run, as the dialogue changes up, helping to make secondary encounters and characters you meet along the way feel a bit more interesting. And then we get to the gameplay, and this was a bit more of a mixed bag for me. Conceptually, it's neat. Control a necromancer and rampage through a trio of levels, each of which culminate in altogether distinct, memorable boss fights. Die, rinse, repeat through a world that is somewhat randomized. The layouts differ to a small degree, but there actually isn't that much in the way of random events, with the most notable being some NPCs you can find in the first two stages, and some optional arenas you can challenge in the midst of your journey for some rewards. No, what actually makes all of this interesting is the way that you tackle these stages, as the Necromancer as a character is both fragile and puny on his own. So in order to progress through the game's various levels, he's forced to rely on the corpses of his enemies, resurrecting them into potent variants of their living selves. And to the game's credit, they have a decent variety of enemies, all with their distinct attack patterns, so bringing them back as corrupted variants feels really good. That said, there's a few caveats. Firstly, the Necromancer can't actually resurrect anyone until all their squad mates are dead. Friendship is magic, I guess. Secondly, the undead decay over time, reducing their max and current health and making them extremely prone to simply keeling over. The latter mechanic is actually fairly interesting, given that you can choose to sacrifice an undead to trigger unique effects based on what they are, as well as any passive spells you've slotted on them in a given run. What's more, doing this or letting them time out grants you Bone Ash, a run-specific currency that you can use to upgrade your weapons, or trade in for gold if you're short at the shop. That said, allowing a minion to be murdered provides no benefit whatsoever, making the choice of when to cull someone a fairly tactical consideration. It's also a decent idea, if only because of the third caveat. While it's really neat to have masses of minions, they're very hard to manage. This was incredibly noticeable the one time I managed to maintain my forces and ramp them up to 200-ish not-so-warm bodies, but even at my average of 50 to 70, the undead have some issues with pathfinding, as they'll often get stuck on small props in the level, or just walls, and it can take them a while to trickle forward, if at all. Which is made worse once you realize they're also a bit bloodthirsty. Specifically, they have a bad habit of ignoring your orders when enemies are around, which can lead to a larger horde, triggering multiple groups and getting you flanked because of their absolute refusal to tactically retreat. Which brings us to caveat number 4. you can actually get stuck in your own horde, which is pretty painful when enemies throw out AoEs and you're drowning in a sea of bodies you've built to the point that you can't even see the markers. And while your dodge can slide you through a small distance, its cooldown means any sustained attacks will likely tag you and blow off chunks of your health bar. And this is especially punishing by the fact that you only start with 3 such health chunks, known as phylacteries, and once they're depleted, they can't be refilled without either finding or purchasing a life spark. Oh, and losing a spark also depletes your max life force, which is the game's MP. Really, the only upshot to all of this is that when a phylactery is depleted, it activates whatever passive effect is associated with the life spark you picked up, though even that's a bit of a cold comfort. And relying on your personal arsenal is a tenuous circumstance, given that your basic ranged attack hits with the force of a wet noodle even when upgraded, and your melee attack is likely to lead you to getting chewed up. You do get the ability to find a pair of alternatives to your basic spell, but you can't choose to start with either of them, and it's random which one you get at the forge areas, though at the very least you can choose to modify and upgrade your weapons there. That said, the one time I got the spear weapon, I really enjoyed the utility of it, as it let me play a very active part in the fight. Or it did, until it nerfed itself halfway through the level, dealing 1/10 of its damage when fully charged, making it even weaker than the basic spell, before it then reverted itself to the basic spell when I beat the boss in changed stages, which yeah, gee, thanks. Which meant that, for me, it was the active spells that did a lot of the heavy lifting across my various runs, but even then, those had their nuances. For one thing, a fair number of them use life force, which is, as I mentioned, a little bit finite sometimes, but made even worse because it's difficult to replenish beyond random potion drops or purchasing new life sparks. Worse, sacrificing units also drains it, something which had me almost strictly leaning into spells which make use of the blood, bones, or souls generated by fallen enemies, or certain other spells and sacrifice skills, as it meant I'd always have something available to me, mostly, because while you can find higher level spells during your run, some of them actually wound up becoming prohibitively expensive as they leveled, to the point that I couldn't actually activate them in all but the most pitched battles. Also, weirdly, even after I got a spell to 6, which I assume is the capped, it kept offering me the exact same spell over and over again, which was incredibly frustrating, especially given that your spell options are also partly limited in the first place, since each pick only gives you a choice of 3, and every spell is associated to a specific active or passive slot. That's right, you can't actually fully mix and match your active spells or your passives, so there's nothing actually preventing the game from just flinging multiple spells at you, which would all occupy a given slot that you just don't want to replace. And this is made even more frustrating when I have to recall just how much scouring I had to do during each stage. Like, yes, I expect exploration in a roguelite, but if you're going to give me a map, please let it actually be useful, especially because the one I am granted is absolutely potatoes. And frankly, I was often left wasting my time and my minions walking back and forth trying to make sure I was actually checking every dead end and not simply progressing forward because it's not abundantly apparent. Especially since I was trying to accrue as many meta resources as possible. As per roguelite natures, there are options to unlock in order to facilitate future runs and inject a bit more variety into each run, and I wanted to see what the game had to offer. In fact, one of the resources you get is strictly for unlocking new spells and skills to find during a run, so for the purists who are averse to making things easier for yourself, you can safely interact with this one, especially since you can't actually deactivate any spells you unlock to remove them from the spell pool. That said, as you progress through your loops, you'll start to unlock more elements at the base, which use your secondary meta currency to do things like adjust the function of your basic spell, increasing your base phylacteries efficiency and adding more of them, and improving the types you can find, and even granting your necromancer passive skills. theoretically for the last one, given that in practice, a fair number of those skills didn't seem to work, or alternatively, the scaling on them failed to do anything even after I invested a bunch of points to just level them. Yeah. Still, that's almost all I have to say about the mechanical side of things, so let's skip over to the graphics, and despite everything, I really do have to give this game credit. It looks quite good, the environments are nice, but most importantly, there is a very solid array of enemies for you to encounter, and I don't just mean because they're mechanically distinct, all of them look and feel different, which is made even better since this carries over to their reanimated forms. And those ones all look, attack, and die differently. It's a fantastically gory good time. Also, the character portraits during dialogue segments are pretty nice and had a bit more range than what I was expecting. On the audio side of things, now, while the game does start out voiced, it doesn't last long beyond a few sound bites here and there, such as generic greeting when talking to an NPC. What is there is nice, but it's not much. That said, I was pretty happy with the overall sound design because despite having absolutely monstrous hordes who are sometimes ranging in the hundreds and engaging small siege worths of humans, it never left me inundated with a deafening mass of hit noises or attack noises. Also, I was altogether fond of the music as it provided a solid variety for both the game's stages and the bosses. That said, if it wasn't abundantly apparent, my time with the Unliving was a flawed experience. That's not to say I didn't have fun. I enjoyed the process of gradually figuring out the nuances of maybe not commanding, since they lacked the wherewithal to really follow specific orders, but directing a tide of undead. There was a fair bit of satisfaction to be found in figuring out the optimal times and types of undead to sacrifice when enemies were giving a spirited resistance from behind a barricade, or the strategic choice of spells, like picking a skill that made a unit explode into bones when they died so I could then use those bones to summon up a turret behind the enemy fortifications. That was legitimately good stuff, as was figuring out the trio of boss encounters that the Unliving had in store for me, with the first encounter feeling especially unique for how it plays out. Unfortunately, that doesn't detract from the fact that a lot of this was me actively working against some of the game's design decisions. So many of my spell choices were made with a constant lack of resources in mind, or an awareness that when my undead reached a barricade, they were likely to just sit in front of it, smacking a single portion as the enemies attack them instead of massing against the edge and shredding it. Occasionally, I'd find myself unable to dodge as well or see the reticle for an AoE, which also meant that I'd lose an entire phylactery worth of life, or even two. I still am sitting here just shaking a bit with rage for my initial run-throughs in Stage 2. It was painful. And it was worse sometimes when I just covered an area in a carpet of corpses and then blew up because I didn't quite notice something in the midst of all that. There was also the outright bugs. I'd alluded to one of them, like the spontaneous nerfing of the spear, but I didn't actually finish that story because it gets more cursed, just worse from there. Since after I beat the boss in that run, a small scene played in which I transitioned to the third stage, and not only did I find that I was no longer using the spear weapon and become the basic weapon, it had leveled down once, and a number of my spells had gone missing, as well as my passive skills attached to my skeletons. And this was after I slogged through the stage while my weapon was nerfed and enemy groups kept bugging out and becoming unresurrectable, because despite me scouring the area and ensuring that there were no survivors, it just decided that there was someone still alive so I couldn't resurrect them. And no, I didn't miss someone. I sat there and ran around that area for 10 fucking minutes until I didn't have anyone in the first place anyways. Also, there was a pair of runs before that. The game had bugged out during the third stage, locking me in an optional arena room after I cleared it and collected the reward, forcing me to give up the entire run. Ultimately, all of these various flaws kept creeping up to get in the way of my enjoyment and to give this undertone of frustration to the whole experience, to the extent that even though I normally enjoy the gradual unfurling of upgrades and roguelites and the very piecemeal storytelling that's often there, I couldn't be bothered to continue killing the second boss in order to advance the plot. Because yes, there's upgrade gating associated with going through the runs multiple times in order to earn what you need for both plot and mechanical reasons. Simply doing so once isn't enough if you're a completionist, but in its current state, the game misses the mark for me. At 9 hours, I'd made my way to the end of its 3rd chapter and received the current ending, the "thanks for playing, it's an early access" screen, and I was done. I could keep going at it, grinding and whittling away at meta upgrades and seeing the story, but at this juncture, I would rather wait to see if the experience improves, given there's been a released roadmap and the developers were at least responsive to the list of bugs I fired their way. Which I guess isn't an entirely bleak last word, since to the Unliving's credit, I am keeping an eye on it just to see if it manages to smooth out all the rough edges and provide me something that is both satisfying and unique that stands apart from its peers in the roguish genre. But that does mean you are going to have to wait for a future episode whenever this fully releases for me to actually provide you a full rating. In the meantime, you can take everything of what I said with a grain of salt and decide for yourself if you want to go and dive into the game or simply keep an eye on it, or if it's just not your cup of tea. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.